Continuing with our voting rights topic, we have Amanda Zarrow with us, joining us from LA. She is a lawyer. She is the director of the Legal and Legislative Tracking arm of the Voting Rights Lab. And she's going to talk to us today about voting rights, obviously, but also to show us the Voting Rights Lab legislative tracking tool. So let's welcome Amanda.
Thank you, everyone. As Ann said, my name is Amanda Zarrow. I am our Director of Legal and Legislative Tracking here at Voting Rights Lab. Here is actually my house, but you get the idea. I'm really so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. So I'm here to talk about voting rights in the state. So I'm going to kind of cover some of the trends that we've been following, but also how to read and understand elections legislation. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. So let me, I want to share my screen with you all. All right, hopefully everyone is looking at my slide deck and we can get started. So a little bit about Voting Rights Lab. We're a nonpartisan organization. We support the movement for free and fair elections through expert analysis, through research and innovations. And as part of that effort, we created a tool called the State Voting Rights Tracker. It is what it sounds like. It's a tool where we track, we analyze, and we categorize literally thousands of elections-related bills from around the country. So I'll be sharing some of the key features of the tracker with you later today. But first, I want to give you kind of a brief overview of where states landed on election-related policies by the end of 2021, and then talk about the key issues that are emerging in state legislative sessions this year. This information was actually the subject of a report that we recently published based on the trends that we were able to identify through our own legislative tracking work. And I'll pause for any questions after I kind of get through that portion. But then I'll move on to cover some of the kind of tricks of the trade that we use here in terms of how to read and understand and talk about voting legislation. And then finally, I'll show you how, as journalists, you can actually leverage our tracking tools to help you to kind of identify trends, learn about elections-related bills in your state, and also to kind of place that legislation in the national context. So let's get started. So I want to start with a look back at 2021. I know there were a number of high-profile bills that made the national news last year for their provisions restricting access to the ballot. We saw obviously a lot of movement in Iowa, Georgia, Texas, but those bills are not the whole story. So we tracked just over 300 elections-related bills that were enacted last year. And of those 301 actually bills, we determined that 117 of them actually improved voter access or the administration of elections. And a significantly smaller number, it was 47, I believe, clearly restrict voter access or interfere with election administration. The remainder of the bills kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So they're either neutral in their effect because they're making kind of more technical changes, or they have really mixed effects on voter access. And the interesting thing that we noticed is that the bills expanding access really came out of red and blue states alike. And these bills cover a number of key areas relating to voter access. So that includes things like the availability of early voting, ballot cure processes, which I'll talk about more in a bit, automatic voter registration at DMVs and at other state agencies, the restoration of voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals, and several other things. So I'll take a few of these kind of one by one and talk about them in a bit more detail. So we'll start with early voting. Going all the way back to 2020, as I'm sure you all know, a number of states kind of temporarily expanded access to early voting just to help facilitate safer voting options during the pandemic and to kind of reduce the pressure on election day voting. As it turns out, voters really across party lines took advantage of those expanded options. So nearly a third of the total ballots cast in the 2020 election were voted in person before Election Day. And during the 2021 sessions that followed in the states, we really did see states across the political spectrum kind of respond by making some of those temporary changes more permanent and making permanent expansions to the availability of early voting. I think in total, we saw 14 states that expanded access, and only one state, Iowa, that did the opposite. Two of the states, Georgia and Texas, really, they enacted provisions that kind of both expanded and restricted access to early voting. But I think notably, we saw Kentucky pass House Bill 574, which created 3 days of early voting. That was a first for the state outside of its kind of temporary COVID rules. And then we also saw a number of states that either added Sunday early voting or kind of expanded their overall number of days and hours that they offered early voting. So that was a pretty significant change that we saw. Another area where we saw a lot of progress was legislation around ballot cure processes. So a cure process is basically, it's a process whereby voters who voted by mail are notified about certain errors on their ballot envelopes. So for example, if they forgot to sign the ballot envelope, they're notified, they're given an opportunity to fix the issue and basically make sure that the ballot is counted. I would say also, in addition to opportunities to fix, the voters' errors, a cure process might give voters the opportunity to verify their identity. If, let's say, for example, an elections official is doing a signature match between the ballot and the signature on file for the voter, and they make the determination that it doesn't look like the signatures match. In a lot of states, a cure process is going to allow the voter to verify their identity in another way and make sure that that ballot is counted. So last year, we saw 13 states, again, across the political spectrum, enacting legislation that either created a cure process for the first time or strengthened an existing process. So that was a pretty significant amount of movement, something we were really excited to see. Another bright spot was automatic voter registration, or AVR. AVR is a process in which a person is automatically and electronically registered to vote whenever they interact with a specific government agency. So more often than not, that's going to be the DMV. Some states have this at other agencies as well. But the basic idea is that they will be automatically registered unless they affirmatively opt out. AVR is really efficient. It basically allows voters to very easily register at the same time that they're applying for their driver's license, renewing their driver's license, updating their address. It's going to minimize potential for sort of inadvertent discrepancies between what's on a voter's ID and what's in their registration record. And in 2021, we saw several states either create or kind of improve and expand upon existing AVR processes. So Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, we're codifying or creating AVR for the first time. New York, they're in the process of implementing an AVR system that I think is supposed to take effect in 2023, but they added the State University of New York as an AVR agency. So students enrolled there will have the opportunity to register automatically as part of their enrollment process. And then other states kind of improved upon existing AVR processes as well. 2021 was also a big year for progress in the voting rights restoration space. So we saw 8 states either restore eligibility or otherwise expand voting access for people with past felony convictions. Of particular note, Connecticut, New York, and Washington are now all states where an individual is eligible to register to vote immediately upon their release from incarceration. So previously, all 3 states required returning citizens to complete probation or parole before they were eligible to vote. Now it's the case that if they're not incarcerated as part of their sentence, they're not disenfranchised at all. And if they are incarcerated, they regain that eligibility immediately after their release. We also saw a lot of positive movement, again, across the political spectrum in terms of legislation around mail ballot tracking. Ballot tracking systems help to improve voter confidence by allowing voters to check on the status of their mail ballot. So typically the system will allow voters to see when their ballot was mailed to them. And after they mail it back, they can see when it was received by elections officials. In some cases, the system will also notify voters of errors or issues with the ballot. So that can be a way that cure process that I talked about earlier gets kicked off in certain states, is through their tracking system. And we saw states ranging from California to Maine to Texas expanding or creating ballot tracking systems. And a lot of states actually, this already existed, but it was something that was kind of only available maybe in bigger cities, or it wasn't available for every election. So a lot of what we saw last year were states basically codifying this practice and saying it's going to be available statewide, it's going to be available for every election. So a pretty significant amount of expansion there as well. Now, with respect to certain election policies, we did see kind of a widening divide among states. So for example, states moved in opposite directions on policies relating to voting by mail, to same-day voter registration, and voter ID as well. So I'll talk about each of these briefly. I'll start with voting by mail. Again, this is another area where, going back to 2020, because of the pandemic, we saw a lot of states making temporary changes to their election policies to allow people to vote by mail during the pandemic. Again, we saw record-breaking turnout, a lot of voters across the political spectrum taking advantage of this option. And so during the 2021 state legislative sessions, actually more than half of states changed their laws in some way to increase the accessibility of mail voting in a more permanent way. California, notably, became the 7th state to automatically mail ballots to all eligible voters for each election. Now, at the same time, more than a dozen states actually rolled back laws and in a way that made it more difficult to vote by mail. These restrictions include legislation in Texas, Georgia, Arkansas, and Florida, requiring voters to either provide a copy of an ID or an ID number with either their mail ballot applications or the ballot itself, or in some cases with both. In the recent Texas primary, voters, not only had to provide an ID number, but it had to be the same one that they registered with. So if it's the driver's license number, it needs to be that. If it's the social security number, it needs to be that. And that resulted in some significant implementation issues. We saw ballot application rejection rates as high as 50%. Ballot and rejection of ballots is, I think, around 20% or even higher. So some pretty significant implementation issues with these ID requirements around voting. And then states also moved in the opposite direction from each other on a number of other mail voting policies. I'm not going to dive into each of them, but things like ballot return deadlines, the use of drop boxes for ballot return, the idea of community ballot return. So that's pretty much when friends, family members, community members are able to return ballots on behalf of other voters. So we saw some states kind of expanding the ability for that to happen and others prohibiting it. And then we also saw some divergent legislation on the use of permanent voter lists. Permanent voter lists basically allow a voter to sign up once to receive a ballot in the mail for all future elections, rather than having to request one every time. So we saw some states expanding that opportunity, while Arizona, I know in particular, actually kind of removed that option. Another area where states diverged is same-day voter registration. This policy allows individuals to register to vote and to cast their ballot on the same day. Either it could be during the early voting period, it could be on election day, and in a number of states, the option is available during both periods. So just over half of states have some form of same-day registration, but 23 states still do not. We saw Montana last year eliminate same-day registration on election day, although they do still have it during the early voting period. In contrast, Hawaii actually expanded its policy. So voters now have the option to register online the same day that they vote in person. Previously, they had to kind of complete the registration process at a voter service center. So that is same-day voter registration. And then finally, in this kind of like mixed bag category, 4 states made their voter ID laws more restrictive for in-person voting. So that was either by eliminating or restricting alternative options for voters who show up at the polls without an ID, or by restricting the types of IDs that are acceptable for in-person voting. At the same time, 2 states actually increased voter access by expanding the types of IDs that are acceptable. So North Dakota now accepts certain student IDs at the polls, and Indiana actually now accepts tribal IDs for the first time. So that was a positive movement there. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the good, the bad. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a trend that began to emerge last year as we were tracking this legislation, and that we're really continuing to follow this session. So as we were tracking this legislation, we started to see a significant number of bills that, rather than attack kind of voter access directly, what they're doing is they're undermining or interfering with the actual administration of elections. So what does that look like? It included bills that shift power to oversee elections, kind of taking it away from career election officials in favor of more partisan actors. We saw legislation that threatened election officials with felony level crimes. We also saw a lot of partisan motivated, really standardless reviews of election results, including a lot of legislation calling for reviews of the 2020 election results again. So last year, we saw 33 states introduce, by our count, over 200 of these types of bills, with 14 states actually enacting legislation in this category. And it's something that we're continuing to follow this year as well. So this is kind of a map giving you a sense of where that legislation was actually enacted, but we will take a closer look at this trend. So the first sort of subcategory of these bills are these partisan election reviews that I talked about. Several states introduced bills calling for an audit of the 2020 election results again. We actually saw several states, of course, initiate these types of reviews extra legislatively, so it wasn't even happening through legislation, which of course to date have turned up no evidence of fraud. In contrast, some of the bills actually apply to future elections, but what distinguishes them from sort of your traditional statistical or risk limiting audit is that these bills, they do a number of things. One is that they grant audit power to partisan officials who don't have election experience. Sometimes granting power to the legislature itself in this regard. They invoke phrases like forensic audit without sort of specifying any sort of process for the audit. Or they issue kind of sweeping mandates to search for fraud. Some target specific jurisdictions within a state on a partisan basis as well. These really open-ended, standardless reviews, in addition to kind of undermining the integrity of our elections, they really place a tremendous strain on the resources of state and local election offices, which, as we all know, are already kind of chronically understaffed and underfunded. So this really is, a significant concern and something that we've been following closely. Other bills in this category place control over election administration and even the election results themselves into the hands of either the legislature or other partisan actors. So, for example, the Georgia election omnibus that we saw last year included provisions that required the state elections board, at the request of partisan legislators, to investigate kind of local election superintendents and replace them if they choose. This process is actually underway in Fulton County. We're kind of seeing it play out in real time. And in Arizona, we saw several bills in 2021 and now moving into this year as well that would give the legislature or other partisan actors the authority to require recounts without any showing of fraud or irregularity, or in some cases just to kind of change or ignore or disregard vote totals. And then finally, a number of states have enacted legislation authorizing new or increased criminal penalties against election officials or against third parties assisting voters. So they're several examples that come to mind. With respect to elections officials, Iowa's election omnibus made it a felony offense for officials to fail to perform official duties. So that could be, simple nonfeasance or negligence, resulting in a felony offense for officials. Other bills target people who are providing assistance to voters. So Texas's SB1 criminalized several aspects of voter assistance, both for mail voting and for in-person voting, without requiring any proof of actual fraud. And a Kansas law made it a felony to falsely represent oneself as an election official. That sounds bad, but the way that the bill was drafted, it actually forced civic groups to stop conducting voter registration drives out of fear of basically being prosecuted under the law because the wording was not clear. And of course, you're all probably aware of the Georgia law last year making it a crime to provide food or beverages to people waiting in line to vote. So in addition to these kind of new criminal penalties, we also saw several states enact or advance laws that increase the role of state investigative agencies and prosecutors in the election process. Kind of related to that, we saw and are continuing to see legislation that creates dedicated investigative units focusing full-time on purported or alleged election crimes or irregularities. So with that, most of that was kind of geared towards what we were seeing by the end of 2021. Looking ahead, the trend continues. As of this week, we're tracking over 2,400 active election-related bills in 45 states and DC. And we're really seeing quite a large number of bills, probably around 250, that if enacted, would really run the risk of interfering with election administration in a number of ways. So close to 70 of those bills would impose these partisan or burdensome election reviews that really differ in kind from your traditional statistical or risk limiting election audit. We're also tracking 56 bills in 18 states that penalize election administrators in various problematic ways. So some of the bills penalize, frankly, good faith job performance, while others would criminalize election officials for taking steps to improve voter access in ways that are currently allowed under existing law. So that would be things like mailing ballot applications to voters. These bills are hugely problematic because, as you can imagine, threatening election workers with criminal and even civil penalties really makes it difficult to retain and to recruit experienced staff. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also seeing legislation and proposals to create these sort of dedicated forces to investigate and prosecute alleged election crimes. So the creation of this kind of entire criminal infrastructure surrounding voting is something that we're watching really closely. 43 of the bills that we're tracking are legislative power grabs, plain and simple. So these are efforts by state legislatures to give themselves a greater role in running elections and in counting votes. And then finally, we're seeing a number of bills that would place unwarranted burdens on, our already limited elections resources. So, for example, some bills would ban the use of electronic tabulators, essentially forcing election administrators to count millions of votes by hand in every election. Others would prohibit election administrators from seeking or receiving private or federal grants to help fill funding gaps. And some of the bills would impose audit or chain of custody requirements that, while not necessarily otherwise objectionable, are so clearly excessive, infeasible, and really disruptive to the administration of elections, kind of all in the name of protecting against the specter of election fraud. So you can read about all of these trends in our recent report. It's available on our website. It's linked in the materials for this presentation. And you can also learn more about the bills that I've been talking about in our state voting rights tracker. And I'm gonna walk you through the tracker in just a bit. So my next section will be about kind of these tips and tricks for reading elections bills and how to use the tracker. But I'm happy to pause now to kind of take any questions on this portion of the presentation before I move on.
Hi, Ian Richardson. I'm with the Des Moines Register in Iowa. And I wanted to ask, to what extent when you're analyzing these laws, are you seeing like maybe model legislation from groups playing a role in this? I know in Iowa, there was a big question as to how much of the law like Heritage Action had written, and that was kind of a thing that Republicans were denying. But like with the stuff you've seen over the last year and kind of the trends you're seeing now, what role are you seeing maybe groups pushing legislation?
That's a really good question. And, I will say that a lot of these policies are both very specific and very widespread. So, for example, I mentioned the bans on private funding. That's something that we saw pop up in one state, two states, a dozen states, and it keeps going. And they look pretty similar to one another. Another thing that we saw last year was quite a few states introducing and enacting legislation that basically restricted who was authorized to return a ballot on behalf of a voter, often kind of restricting it to like immediate family members or household members. And that language looked very similar across states. So I think, we do see a lot of times, especially with these like more kind of discrete policies, we see them pop up one place, two places, and all of a sudden they're everywhere. And I actually think one of the things about our tracker that's really useful is the way that you can kind of search for things by the topic and the subtopic kind of helps you to like suss out where some of these trends are gaining traction across states and see where it's, this is not just a Georgia thing or a Texas thing or a Colorado thing, what have you, but actually something that's kind of sweeping the nation, so to speak. So I definitely want to kind of walk you through how you can leverage the tool to spot those things, because that is absolutely something we see a fair amount of.
Hi, my name is Meredith. I'm a reporter with the News Journal in Delaware. I have two questions. One is about open/closed primaries. I'm curious where that ranks to you in terms of access and participation priorities. And I ask that because a group of Republicans have introduced a bill in Delaware, which is controlled by Democrats, hoping to have open primaries. But Democrats aren't interested in taking it up at all to even vote. And so I was just curious if you're seeing any democratically controlled states that might not be interested in expanding certain election rights or aren't really doing anything to expand election rights.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will say, as an organization, we don't kind of the idea of primaries generally is not something that we dig into too deeply. But I will say, look, we're a nonpartisan organization. Our focus is on voter access and election administration. And we see states of all political stripes doing all sorts of interesting things. So I think, one interesting example might be redistricting, where, we do track bills that, for example, relate to what the redistricting process looks like. We don't typically kind of track and analyze the map drawing legislation itself. But that's somewhere that you see, you might have a captive audience of any political persuasion. And so you can certainly dig in and see what's going on. And, it's not, some of these issues are not necessarily limited to one party or another, but that's kind of the example that comes to mind. But I don't know if that's directly relevant to your question, but I think, again, that's actually another place where our tracker can be really interesting, is you can sort of sort by different states that you're interested in based on kind of what the political context is, and see sort of where they fall on issues ranging from expanding early voting access to redistricting to, voter ID and things like that. Okay, great. All right, well, moving ahead, just one moment. Okay, so, and I think I jumped a slide. There we go. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the tips that I can share for analyzing and reading elections legislation for those of you who may find yourself covering these bills. Truthfully, a lot of these tips probably apply equally to other types of legislation, but these are kind of all things that are part of my team's practice when we're looking at election bills. So the first is pretty straightforward and basic. It's just to understand the players. You want to familiarize yourself with the sponsor and any co-sponsors, and you want to understand their legislative objectives. So a lot of times, changes to voting procedures, and especially to election administration, can be really technical. It's not clear on the bill's face why the change is being made or why it matters. Just knowing who the bill sponsor is and what he or she has said about voting and elections can go a long way in helping you kind of begin to piece things together. So that's the very first kind of starting point. Another thing I would say is to the extent that the state provides a bill summary as a part of the piece of legislation, use that as a starting point. Not all states provide them. They vary in their level of detail and their quality. But when they are provided, it's a great way to like orient yourself as to the bill's basic content. But I will say it can be tempting to kind of rely on them when talking about what a bill does and you're strapped for time. But you shouldn't rely on them completely. So don't expect them to capture every detail in a bill, and don't expect them to kind of give you the necessary context to understand a bill's practical effect. They are intended to summarize the changes to existing provisions in a very literal fashion. So I think they're an incredibly useful tool. I think they're not a substitute for reading the bill itself. So I would always encourage you, use it to orient yourself to what is going on here generally, and then dig into the provisions and make sure that it's lining up with your understanding of what the bill does. The next one is a pretty big one. Know the context. So when reading and discussing a bill, it's really essential to be aware of existing law on the subject, the established or informal practice relating to the topics covered by the bill, the political context, the relevant litigation relating to the issue. So basically all of the background rules against which the bill is operating. So I'll kind of break that down a little bit. So in terms of existing law, so some states, I think Arizona is an example, they include the entire text of any section that's being amended in the bill, and they're clearly going to identify the amending language. Other states only include like the very specific subsection that's being affected. And you kind of can't really tell what the rest of the section's about and how this piece fits in. And other states, I think Massachusetts is an example, they actually just don't mark up changes at all. So they'll basically say, strike the old section, insert this new language. This is what the provision will look like now. So if it's not clear how a bill is changing existing law, you've got to go to the original source, pull up the original provision. Don't rely on the bill alone if it's not clear, because often once you pull up the full section, you'll realize that it fits in a different way than you anticipated. Another big piece of it is the background rules and practice in the state. So think about this as an example. Let's say you have a bill that is establishing hours, like operating hours and specific requirements for ballot drop boxes. That bill is going to have a very different effect in a state that previously banned drop boxes as compared to one where the law was silent, and maybe in practice their use was really widespread. It was well funded by the state, with pretty limited restrictions on how they could operate. So in state A, where drop boxes were banned before, this bill might be a significant expansion of access to drop boxes. While in state B, a bill that's saying, okay, well, they can only be open during these hours and they need to meet these requirements, can actually operate to restrict access. And it is not always clear just from reading the text itself. So it's really important to understand those background rules and the background practice in the state. It's also important to talk to folks on the ground. Is the bill a reaction to prior events? Is it a response to litigation? You might learn, for example, let's say you have a bill that prohibits election officials from distributing unsolicited absentee ballot applications. You may find out from talking to advocates in the state or from talking to elections officials, maybe this bill was in response to a Democracy in the Park event, where local officials were kind of meeting with community members and helping them to apply for ballots. You might discover, there's a bill being introduced that allows residents to obtain an ID free of charge. That sounds great. What that could actually be is a precursor to a legislative intent to kind of tighten the state's voter ID laws, without running afoul of sort of requirements from a prior court order saying, hey, if you're going to have a tough voter ID law, you've got to have free IDs. So you always need to fit it into kind of that broader context and be aware of these background rules. Another piece is to read the bill holistically. Whenever it is possible, read the entire bill, or at a minimum, you really want to search the bill for those relevant terms and phrases that you're looking for. I'm sure this is no surprise to any of you who've spent any time with any sort of legislation, but because bills are organized sequentially by section number and not thematically, you're often going to find provisions on a single topic just scattered throughout a bill in an order that would not in any other context make any sense. And then finally, This is a little in the weeds, but you really want to pay attention to cross-references and to amendments. And when I talk about cross-references, what I mean are references in a bill provision to either an existing code section that's not in the bill, or to another section of the bill itself. So, a bill might say, all right, well, a ballot that's cast by a voter who shows up at the polls without ID will be, quote, processed in accordance with the procedures outlined in subsection 104. Well, when you go and actually look at subsection 104, it might tell you, okay, this relates to provisional ballots. And a provisional ballot is not going to be counted unless the voter shows up at the election office the next day with that copy of their missing ID. So these are really critical details that can be kind of not maliciously buried in this way, but are just, it's the nature of the way the bills are written. And you really have to do your homework and sort of investigate those cross-references pretty deeply. And then finally, just with respect to bill amendments, look, state practice varies pretty significantly in terms of how amendments are presented. If you're trying to figure out how the latest version of a bill differs from a prior version, like version compare software of any type can be your best friend. It's not always perfect. It can be a really tough process sometimes, but we always recommend kind of giving that a shot. That can be tricky. Truthfully, all of this can be pretty tricky, especially when you're working on a tight deadline, as I know you all probably are very often. And that is why we've tried to do some of this work for you. So I would love to take a little bit of time to talk about our state voting rights tracker. This is a tool that we launched in 2019. It allows users to explore pending voting and elections legislation in all 50 states and in DC. And it's also actually going to allow you to explore current voting laws in each state. So I just kind of want to touch on some of the tracker's core functionalities. If you bear with me a second, I'm going to flip my screen share over to the tracker itself so that you can follow along with me as I kind of walk through it. So here we go. Okay, hopefully you're all looking at the state voting rights tracker. So first and foremost, we have our legislative tracker. This is our comprehensive bill search page, as we call it. This is where you can explore, you can search for pending and enacted legislation by state, by the bill number, if you already know it, by a topic or a subtopic. You can also search by the bill's stage in the legislative process. So for example, you can just filter to see bills that have already been enacted this session. You also can kind of search by our assessment of the bill's overall impact on voter access and on the administration of elections. So let's say, for example, you want to check out the bills that relate to that concept of interference with election administration that we were talking about. You simply want to go to topic, select interference with election administration, and that's going to show you that so far this session or this year, we've seen 250 bills introduced in 33 states on this subject. And you can actually further refine your results based on the specific kind of subtopic within this category. So let's say you want to see bills that would interfere with the certification of results. Once you make that selection, you'll see we have 7 bills so far this year across the 50 states. You also can sort your results by the column headers here. And once you've found a bill that interests you, you can click on the bill to pull up the bill profile. So a bill profile, it's going to contain the bill's kind of essential information. So that's going to be the author, a link to the current bill text, the introduction date, the latest action on the bill's stage in the legislative process. And importantly, it's going to include our sort of analysis of the bill, the key portion of which is this VRL summary. The summary provides an overview of the bill's key provisions. It's going to be typically organized thematically by kind of subject area rather than by section number. So that's kind of sort of helps you to reorient that information as compared to reading the bill itself. The summary is going to tell you what are the changes that the bill would make to existing law? How does this differ from existing law? And if the bill has been amended, it's also going to tell you how each provision differs from the previous version of the bill. So that's kind of the bill profile. But once you've found kind of the set of bills or a search that interests you, you have a couple of options. You can download your search results into a CSV file. This can be really helpful if you're trying to run data on a large set of bills and you want to kind of play around with it a little bit. You also can get a shareable link so that you can send a link to your colleague and say, hey, look at these 23 bills that would cut early voting hours. So that can be a helpful tool. And then a feature we've added this year is the ability to toggle between years. And so you can actually look back at 2021 and see sort of how the volume of bills compares year over year and see kind of what's different between last year and the next. And of course, we hope to continue to build on that now that we have that feature and add additional years as we go. So that's kind of the basic bill tracker. We also have a legislative snapshot page. This is where we track the progress of legislation touching on kind of some key areas of national significance that we've identified. And it really just shows you, let me refresh. We just rolled out a new feature and I noticed it was being a little bit buggy about all right, there are our bills. So it's kind of showing you the progress of bills as they move through the legislative process on a number of issues. So you can expand a particular issue. You can see, all right, what's actually passed through two chambers. We've got some bills here, one from Kansas. You can click on that, pull up the bill profile, find out about that bill in particular. But it's basically just meant to be a snapshot. It's not every issue area that we cover, but it's some of the things that we've had a lot of interest in or a lot of inquiries about that we wanted to kind of highlight and help show, what's the movement on this issue this year. You also can explore particular issues relating to elections. So for example, you can go to our voter ID page. And in addition to, you're going to get the relevant legislation on the subject. And again, I'm just going to refresh one more time because I think our rollout has created a couple of little bugs, but we also have this existing law section. And this is basically a survey of what the voter ID rules are in all 50 states. So you can see, for example, okay, here are the states where ID is like affirmatively required to vote with no sort of alternative options. And you can click on either in the map or here, you can click on an individual state name, and that's going to pull up kind of the full rule for you on how voter ID works in that state. And each of these pages, you'll have the opportunity to select more questions. You can go over to this list view that we have as well. And this basically just allows you to see the full kind of detailed answer for all 50 states sequentially instead of having to jump back and forth in the maps. But we have most of the issues that we track in the bill tracker. We also have surveys of existing law for, not every single one, but we're working on expanding those all the time. So that could be a helpful resource when you're trying to figure out, okay, what is the background rule in the state and like how long has it been that way? You can kind of use this other feature in our tracker to get that important context. You also, if you're just interested in a particular state, you can go to the state page. So let's say I meant to click on Colorado, but let's say you're interested in Kansas. You can jump over to the Kansas page and just see the bills that have been introduced in Kansas this year. And you also can drop down and see kind of what is the existing law on, for example, absentee voting, on voter ID. And this is just going to be specific to Kansas. So if you really are focused on a particular state, that can be a helpful resource to kind of jump directly to what you're interested in. And then finally, we have kind of what we call our insights and analysis. This is just where our editorial content lives. The report that I mentioned earlier lives here. We also have a weekly newsletter called The Markup. And that's just basically what's the legislation that we're watching this week, what's going to have a hearing, what just was enacted over the past week. So it kind of orients you to what we have eyes on each week. And then, of course, like other reports that we publish throughout the year can be found here as well. So that is, I think, the tracker in the nutshell. I'm going to jump back over to our slides. Resources. The tracker you can find at tracker.votingrightslab.org. We are always happy to offer kind of more detailed demos of the tool to members of the press. That's something that we do a lot. So if anyone in your organization is interested in sort of learning how to use some of the different tools, the subtopic filters, all the different pieces, we're happy to schedule a demo for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. As I mentioned, our weekly newsletter, the markup, there's a link in this slide deck for you to sign up for that if you're interested. A link to our latest report that sort of informed the first portion of my presentation. And then I know I talked a lot about this kind of new trend evolving about related to interference with election administration. So in addition to following that in the bill tracker, we also kind of created this 50-state chart where you can visualize how much movement we've seen in the various sort of subcategories within this topic across all 50 states. So I have a link to that chart as well, which I think is a really helpful tool to understand kind of the scope of the different, problematic types of legislation that we're seeing and that we're following. So I think that is pretty much it. And I'm happy to take any questions on the tracker or on reading bills or anything else that you might have.
Amanda, thank you so much. Really fantastic. Who wants to kick us off?
Hi, Joseph Bustos, reporter with the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina. More of a technical question. How often are you updating the tracker with new legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a team checking daily for updates. So that's newly introduced bills, amendments to bills, any sort of bill movement. It is not instantaneous. So the bills have to get uploaded to the legislative service that we use to sort of import all the bill text. And then our team needs time to just kind of write up the analysis. So typically what we aim for is like within 24 to 48 business hours of a bill being introduced or amended, our analysis is up. If it is a really high profile bill that we know there are a lot of eyes on, or if we get a specific request from someone for a quick turnaround on analysis, we'll often fast track that. I know there were several examples or situations last year where people actually couldn't get their hands on an amended version of a bill. And so we were able to kind of like track one down and get it up on the tracker even before it was sort of widely available. But as a general rule, unless it's something high profile, it's kind of following that goal of 24 to 48 hours to get our analysis up.
Hey, Andy Chow with Ohio Public Radio State House News Bureau. I think you said that you started this in 2019, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What's something that now in 2022 is a big trend that wasn't even registering in 2019? What are some of the big things that are now a big issue of focus that didn't even exist in 2019?
Yeah, look, 2020 changed everything, right? So I think when we started this tool, we expected to follow along with a lot of legislation around, states that were increasing or decreasing, like is an excuse required to vote absentee? Do we automatically mail ballots to voters? How many hours of early voting do we offer? And all of that is true. And we continue to see a lot of that. But I think the things that we did not expect, number one, was the wave of sort of temporary COVID related legislation that we saw in 2020. So it was kind of a drastic sort of supercharge of legislation related to kind of expanding ballot access in ways that sort of limited exposure to COVID. So that's kind of the mail voting access, the early voting access pieces that we talked about. A lot more, at a minimum, temporary practices of actually just mailing ballots to voters automatically. But at the same time, a huge backlash to that, right? So, post 2020, we're seeing a lot of bills trying to kind of walk some of this stuff back. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, in terms of what was actually enacted, on balance, it was more expansive of access than restrictive. But we've seen a lot of bills sort of that are a reaction as well to the expanded access in 2020. And then the other piece is really this it's amorphous in some ways, but this kind of emerging trend of targeting election administrators themselves and the administration of elections. I don't think we saw that coming at all, frankly. And it's been something that we've really dug in deep on, because it is, it's about the way our elections operate. It's about how our ballots are counted, our elections are certified. It's about how our elections are funded. Really critical stuff that I think, is very behind the scenes in a way. So, it's really easy to focus on the things like how a voter accesses their ballot, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that has, really, I think, become the focus over the last year in particular. So I think that's absolutely kind of the number one area where we've seen things kind of change drastically since we started the tracker.
I think you mentioned text comparison tools. Are there any that you prefer?
Honestly, I think the Word version one is just as good as any other. It also depends a lot on the state, and do they provide rich text formats of their bills, and like how do they mark up their bills? Because sometimes version compare is going to work great in one state, and another it's like the way that they mark up changes, it's just not going to be very useful. But it's not, I don't know that there's any particular tool, or at least sort of freely accessible tool that's better than others. It's really kind of more a question of like how the state makes their bill text accessible and how they mark up the proposed changes in a bill that's going to determine whether or not it's a useful resource to you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hey, Jasper Scher with the Houston Chronicle. I'm curious if there are, for states like Texas that, in contrast to some of the more expansive states you were mentioning, the states that have restricted access over the last year or so, are there any kind of, provisions that could come in the future that you're keeping an eye on, that you're kind of wary about? And I know there were a lot of, initial parts of the Texas voting bill that didn't ultimately, that got taken out, that would have like redistributed polling sites away from, certain areas, things like that. I guess I'm just wondering if any of those are, particularly drawing your attention that could come up in the future.
Look, I think truthfully, a lot of what we're seeing in 2022 is stuff that we did see in 2021 that maybe gained a little bit of traction, but didn't quite get across the finish line. And that's, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we're continuing to see, bills that would roll back early voting hours, or, the number of locations that a local jurisdiction can offer. One thing that we saw a lot of course, I think Texas is an example, is where particular jurisdictions within the state were taking advantage of kind of the option to provide additional early voting hours or additional early voting locations. And then state legislatures in response are kind of cracking down on that, so to speak, and placing caps on, the maximum number of early voting days or the maximum number of hours. So we saw that. I think we're going to continue to see that. Really, a couple of things that I think are really continuing full steam into 2022 are this idea of criminalizing various components of the administration of elections, criminalizing third-party assistance, not even necessarily requiring, fraudulent intent, but creating a real risk that would-be voter assistants or would-be election officials will be, frankly, too afraid to do their jobs out of fear of criminal prosecution. And I think that plugs into what I was mentioning about this entire sort of criminal infrastructure that we're seeing being built around elections right now, with states sort of dedicating task force to investigate election crimes or election fraud, or kind of taking that jurisdiction, for example, away from election officials and giving it to traditional investigative or prosecutorial units within the state, or creating new units. So I think that's something we're continuing to see a lot of. And then truthfully, the restrictions on private funding, we've seen a lot of just really continuing. So, I think that was a very long-winded way of saying, yes, these things that I think you saw last year, we're going to continue to see. But a lot of it has been around, the legislature trying to take an increased role in how elections are conducted, how ballots are tallied, how elections are certified, that sort of thing. So it's something that we're watching really closely.
Hi, Jessie Opoyan with the Capital Times in Wisconsin. I'm wondering if you guys are paying attention to, I'm sure you're paying attention to, but if you track at all when these laws or these proposals end up tangled up in lawsuits and kind of, I guess, how much of this policy ends up getting decided by judges rather than by the legislature, the governor?
That's a really great question. And I think in some policy areas, we see a lot more litigation than others. I'll say a few that come to mind. Voter ID laws, lots of litigation around that. We see a fair amount of litigation around anytime a state tries to implement some sort of proof of citizenship requirement to register. That's typically going to draw litigation. We've seen obviously in 2020, we saw a ton of litigation around, the action or lack of action on the part of states to sort of make voting accessible in light of the pandemic. And I think a lot of the states that ultimately implemented kind of a ballot cure process, which I mentioned earlier, some of those came about initially through litigation. So, you had voter advocacy groups or voters themselves filing lawsuits saying, hey, ballots are being tossed out because someone has made the determination that my signature didn't match my own signature, and I didn't have an opportunity to be notified of that or to fix the mistake. So we are always keeping an eye on this. The legislative tracker doesn't track litigation in that way. But number one, it's typically a part of our editorial content. If there's a big lawsuit that's sort of affecting how these policies are going to shake out in a state where we've seen new legislation. And then also, if you look at our survey of existing law, a lot of times you will see in a state, okay, well, yes, North Carolina has this particular voter ID law on the books. However, it's been enjoined due to this lawsuit that's still ongoing, and here's a link to the lawsuit. So that's kind of the way that you'll sort of find that information on our site, but we're always trying to keep our eyes on the litigation surrounding these issues. And like I said, some of them will really invite quite a bit of litigation, and so it's very important to keep eyes on it.
The part of the tracker that is the VRL analysis or the summary, who authors that?
So that's just members of our organization. We have a policy team of folks who have a number of years experience in legislative work in various contexts, but election legislation in particular. So our policy team of lawyers, essentially, who've been working in this space for quite a while. And we're always happy. We really want to be a resource to the press. So we're always happy to field questions for stories that you're writing. We can help navigate the tracker, but we also, if you're like, hey, I'm curious about a particular issue and I don't see it in the tracker, a lot of times we have like internal research that we've been doing that we can kind of help pull together to be of assistance to reporters. And then, of course, if you have particular questions about a report that we've put out, we're happy to assist with that as well.
This was so useful. I'm sure that we'll all be going to the tracker. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm really happy to do it. We really want this tool to be a resource for people. We know that there's just so much of this legislation, and it can be really hard to sort of place what's going on in your state in the national context. And it can also be just really hard to make sense of it. So that's what we're trying to do. We want to be a resource to you. Please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out if we can ever be of assistance in navigating the tracker or in kind of researching any sort of issue related to voter access or to this administration of elections topic that I've talked about.
Super important. Thank you so much, Amanda.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone.